So what we're going to be talking about today is the muscles revolving around the wrist. So we'll first start off with pronator quadratus. Pronator quadratus inserts originates at the anterior distal aspect of the ulna, and it inserts to the distal anterior lateral aspect of the radius. And what that does is that pronates the forearm, but also provides stabilisation for the radio-ulnar joint. Then we've got the flexor digitorum profundus, and that originates from the posterior lateral aspect of the ulna and inserts to the palmar side of the distal phalanx of the second, third, fourth and fifth digit. And what that does is that flexes the wrist and also flexes the metacarpal phalangeal joints and the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints. Then we've got flexor digitorum superficialis, which originates from the common flexor region, which is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and it comes to the radial head, and then the mid third of the radius also, and then it inserts to the again palmar side of the proximal phalanx of the second, third, fourth and fifth. And as it originates on the medial epicondyle, it's a weak elbow flexor, and it also flexes the wrist, but also flexes the metacarpal phalangeal joints and the proximal interphalangeal joints of the second, third and fourth digit. So with flexor digitorum superficialis, we don't get any flexion at the distal interphalangeal joints. And that's that. Then we'll talk about the flexor carpi radialis. Again, comes from the medial epicondyle past the radius and inserts to the second and the palmar side of the second and third metacarpal bone. And what that does is that also flexes the wrist, but also radial deviates the wrist as well. Then we've got flexor carpi ulnaris, which again originates from the medial epicondyle and comes down the ulna and inserts to the pisiform, the hook of hamate and the base of the fifth digit. And what that does is that also flexes the wrist, but also ulnar deviates the wrist also. Then we've got flexor pollicis longus, which originates from the distal anterior surfaces of the radius and inserts to the palmar side of the distal phalanx of the first digit. What that does is that flexes the thumb at the metacarpal phalangeal joint and the interphalangeal joint of the thumb, but also assists in radial deviation at the wrist. Then we've got palmaris longus. 10% of the population don't have this muscle, but it comes again from the common flexor region, which is medial epicondyle, and comes into the palmar aponeurosis. And what this does is this tightens the palm, but also it's a weak elbow flexor, but it flexes the wrist also. And that's the flexors. We'll now talk about the extensors. We've got extensor. Let's just think there. We've got extensor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis brevis. And what this comes from the lateral epicondyle, the common extensor region, which is the lateral epicondyle, which is here, the humerus, and inserts to the third dorsal base of the third metacarpal bone. And what this does is this extends the wrist, and also it also, according to some texts, plays in some involvement with a weak flexor of the elbow, but it also radial deviates the wrist as well. Then we've got extensor carpi radialis longus, which comes from the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus and inserts to the dorsal base of the second metacarpal bone. And this does the same jobs as the brevis. It's according to some texts, it's a weak elbow flexor. Obviously, the main function of it is it extends the wrist and also radial deviates the wrist. And then we've got extensor carpi radialis, which comes from the lateral epicondyle. No, sorry, we haven't got that. We've got extensor digitorum, which comes from the lateral epicondyle and comes down and inserts to the dorsal aspect of the distal phalanxes. And what this does is this extends the wrist and also extends the second, third, and fourth digits at the metacarpal phalangeal joints and the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints. Then we've got extensor pollicis longus, and that originates from the posterior lateral 1/3 of the ulnar and the interosseous membrane, and inserts to the dorsal side of the distal phalanx of the thumb. And what it does, that assists in radial deviation, but also extends the thumb at the metacarpal phalangeal joint and the interphalangeal joint. And then we've got extensor pollicis, and we've got extensor pollicis brevis, which originates from the posterior aspect of the radius and inserts to the proximal phalanx of the first digit. And what this does is this extends the thumb, and it also plays support in providing radial deviation movement as well. And that's the extensor pollicis brevis. Then we've got the extensor digiti minimi, which again comes from the common extensor region, which is the lateral epicondyle, and inserts to the distal phalanx of the fifth digit, or other known as the extensor expansion region. And what this does is it extends the fifth digit at the metacarpal phalangeal joints and the distal and proximal interphalangeal joints, and also plays with support with extending the wrist also. Then we've got extensor indicis, which comes from the posterior surfaces of the ulna and inserts to the interosseous membrane. It still originates from the interosseous membrane and the posterior surfaces of the ulna, and it inserts to the dorsal side of the second digit of the distal phalanx. And what this does again is plays support with radial deviation and extension of the second digit of the metacarpal phalangeal joint. So this movement here. Then we've got extensor. We've said extensor indicis. We've said extensor pollicis brevis. We've said extensor digiti minimi. Then we've got extensor carpi ulnaris. Again, comes from the lateral epicondyle. It comes past the ulna, and it originates on the dorsal base of the fifth metacarpal bone. So here, and then what that does, it ulnar deviates the wrist and also extends the wrist. Then we've got abductor pollicis longus, which originates from the posterior lateral aspect of the 1/3 of the ulna and inserts to the base of the first metacarpal. And what that does is that adducts and abducts the thumb, and also plays a role within radial deviation, I think. And I think that's all the muscle of the wrist. Thanks for watching.